stuff. Okay, the last one, systemantics. So this one's exciting for a number of reasons. I think systemantics is a very interesting book. It kind of reads, it reads like a Bible, right? It's actually, the full title is like the Bible of Systems or something like that. And it's a lot of like commandment type bull, like you can see here, like all capitals, just kind of like, this is the way it is. But like, it also kind of like is, I don't know, any large system is going to be operating most of the time in failure mode. I think a good example of this is, I mean, like, we just talked about like the giant system of like the Earth, for example, and that is a large system. And then we have to kind of like ask the question of what does it mean to be in failure mode? I think failure mode we just said that the Earth is a simple system, right? So it says a large system might not be large on the physical scale. It might mean large as in complexity, but let's like run this thought experiment. So if we have like a large system like the Earth that's going to be operating most of the time in failure mode, it needs to use physics to basically fall to the lowest energy state possible, right? So like if you like look at like the early state of like the universe, when the universe is like or solar system is supernova. Solar system early. So if you ever seen those pictures of like the early super system, I keep calling it super system. I'm trying to say solar system. So these early photos of the solar system, shit was chaotic, right? Like things were just crashing into each other. Everything was on fire all the time. The sun has just erupted and pushed all of this gas out and dust into the far reaches of the solar system, which became planets, the gas giants, for example. And that, I don't know if that's like a kind of quote unquote failure mode, because I guess from a perspective of kind of like chaos, it is a failure mode. So it's trying to drop into a failure mode of stability, right? So even though we see the current state of the solar system as stability, it's like kind of like the failure mode of this gas, right? Because it's like the gas is running into itself and then being like, I fail, and then we run into each other, and then we fail harder, and then we fail into the other piece of dust, and then it just becomes planets, literally. So that's kind of interesting. I think, when applied to large systems that are complex, like the human body is a good one, right? So the human body is a complex system with a lot of moving parts. The limbic system, the nervous system, the circulatory system, the musculature, the skeletal muscular system, all of these systems are constantly kind of, it's weird because like I don't know this because I'm not a biology student, and hopefully somebody will eventually come to the chat one day who knows more about this than I do. But like I'm interested to know like why the human body is so good at surviving those first 30 years. And that's not even the case, right? We were just talking about how smallpox killed a bunch of children, right? But it's like all of these systems feel so fragile, and yet people live most of their lives fine until the very end where it's very painful. So it's just kind of interesting that these complex systems but then also a complex system can make a new complex system when it comes to birth. Like that's a really interesting thing too. And is that like a failure mode? Like what does that mean? I don't know. I don't agree with everything that I've read from this book, but I think that it's kind of interesting. When a fail-safe system fails, it fails by failing to fail safe. So that's based. Studying bugs for their own sake has all of the charm of studying how the paint cracks on an old master, or how many ways a typewriter key can stick. We don't want to know all that. We just want our systems to work smoothly as real life as they did in our fantasies when we were planning to buy or build them. Yeah, I agree with this. I think as a programmer, you learn to kind of like your bugs because you have to. But like when you buy something off the shelf, you don't feel the need to kind of debug it when it breaks. So you kind of want to adopt systems that just feel simple. So like honestly, a lot of these companies have really just figured out how to turn complex systems into something so simple that they can sell it, right? And even no matter how much complexity, they're actually hand waving in the back. Only the most banal type of bugs are related to component reliability. A failure rate of 1 in a million is regularly achieved by computers whose parent companies have a failure rate of 1 in 3, leaving the purchaser with a complete system that lacks a maintenance function. This is so funny. Like it's like this is kind of, again, alludes to like this kind of startup ecosystem that we live in right now, and kind of is dying out because the economy is not dying a little bit. We're heading into a recession, where it's just like this idea of just like wanton investments in groups of people who are just completely unstable, right? Like there's like even if they're very intelligent and they're actually making a system that's really technologically solid, and has an extremely low failure rate because their engineers work day and night to really kind of like cover all of the use cases, and the designers stayed up all night to make sure the affordances were locked in, and everybody on the team team is doing their best to make sure that the system operates the way that it was promised on delivery, but then the system itself, that the company, is just trash, right? Like most companies are run like garbage because they're just kind of dealt with the egos of the leadership and the principal agent problem of the people who work there, right? So it's like the principals have their own kind of whatever problems, and then the agents are the employees, and they're just kind of like, I have my own problems, and like nobody wants to work with nobody. And like it just, like, I love this concept of like whose parent companies have a failure rate of 1 in 3. I think that's like that. I want to put that on a shirt. Like that's just so funny. A special type of bug is represented by the toaster, which sometimes burns the toast, or the air conditioner that sometimes fails to cool, usually on the second day of a 10-day heat wave. So yeah, this is kind of, also the case where it's like the technology you build isn't built for the worst day, it's built for most of the regular days, right? So if you're building it, and this is the reason I think of this, is that you are building it usually in a regular day, right? Like if I'm building a internet thing, right, I'm building it when the internet is on and my bandwidth is high. So I'm not really accounting for how do I build my system if I actually have 0 frames per second or something like that, or like 0 kind of like latent, like my latency is super high. So this is it's an interesting kind of concept where it's just like, it's always when the worst thing happens that it actually just all comes crumbling down, which is always the worst day. So yeah, that leads to this final concept of cherish your bugs, study them. I think that as a programmer, you're forced to do this. As a doctor, you're also forced to do this because you have a bunch of people who are coming in, and you cherish their the idea that you can help make them better, and they're suffering from a bug, so you study the bug. I don't really think that, in programming, you have to cherish your bugs because the system just really won't work unless you solve that particular thing, which is again why I think companies fail, because it's like you can't cherish the bug because it's basically just the Game of Thrones, but in real life and stupid. Real novelty in the world increases as complexity increases. So this is kind of like the idea that all luxuries eventually become obligations. This is a quote that I think I got from The Black Swan that I think about a lot, where it's like this idea that you invent the car and everybody's like, hell yeah, brother, like we don't need to take horses to work anymore. And then people are like, oh, now we need roads. And now there's car accidents and people are getting thrown from cars. People don't get, what I mean? People got thrown from horses, but like it was usually less fatal for people who weren't on the horse. Maybe, if the person thrown from the horse might die, but like car accidents in particular cause people who aren't in the car, like who are pedestrians, to die. Right? So because the complexity of the world increased, we now have new novelty. There's a new thing. It's like, oh wow, so we solved smallpox, but now people are dying in plane crashes because we have planes now. As systems expand, new functions appear suddenly in stepwise fashion, and we may add the new function typically bears no more resemblance to the old than a souffle resembles the humble egg from which it is derived. So I just found this to be really interesting too, where it's just like this idea of like you can have this kind of like stepwise kind of like 0 to 1 type thing, where a lot of we don't think about how many raw materials we use in our life until semiconductor factories go down, right? Like we don't think about silicon being a rock that actually exists in the ground that powers our computers so we can play World of Warcraft, like myself, for hours in a day, until we realize that, oh no, there are literally cables under the sea that are made up of fiber optic glass that move data across the ocean. Fiber optic undersea cable. Copy both of these. Like these are literally physical objects that have breaking points and are made up of like the quote unquote egg of this is like metals and stuff like that, and electricity, right? Things that exist in the real world that you can process on a computer and stuff like that. So it's just really interesting. As systems grow in size and complexity, they tend to lose basic functions. This one's kind of interesting because it's like if you add 50 features to a website, it no longer does its first feature because the first feature is no longer the main thing. So basically what this means is that like one of the reasons I love Obsidian so much, and one of the big purposes of this stream, is to show people that like you can make Obsidian as basic or as complex as you want it to be and scale it back super quickly and then explode it super quickly. And that's a huge deal. Like you need to be able to say like, the system is too complex, I need to roll it back. Or like you need to be able to say like, oh, here's a brand new stepwise fashion system that will literally change the way that I'm doing things. So I need to be able to implement it like right now. And Obsidian is amazing at both of those things, whether through just adopting a plugin that changes everything or writing one that changes everything, or being like, this one's just too much, I'm going to go back to just having a plain note. So mad props. as always, to Obsidian. Shortly after World War II, the British, in order to relieve a shortage of cooking oil, embarked on a gigantic plan to grow ground nuts, peanuts, in East Africa. The plan came to grief after 8 years of fighting hostile soil and adverse climatic conditions. $80 million were lost. The project was abandoned when someone finally remembered that it was West Africa, not East Africa, where peanuts thrive. I think that this is just hilarious, right? Like this idea that, like, again, just like you hear from somebody who heard from somebody who heard from somebody, and nobody like stops to like verify that knowledge because it just sounds correct because it either came from someone who is above you on a ladder, or you just are like, yeah, no, that sounds reasonable, right? And it's just like such a a funny thing to imagine, like the British Empire losing just so much money and people, and then just wasting a bunch of time and causing just a bunch of just terrible climactic disaster for the native people of East Africa, and then just for like one dude to be like, oh yo, like I think it was West Africa. You know what I mean? Like that just like again shows like the environmental aspect of these systems, where it's like you can't really control aspects of the systems that you think you can control. Sometimes you're just stuck in a supply chain thing where you're like, okay, this has to work because this is where this is, and if it doesn't work, then our system is just broken. We have to start from zero again. So we have to build up from a simple system of saying, where do brown nuts grow? However, the salient feature of most mad and eccentric behavior is not its effectiveness, but rather its incredible ingenuity, such that merely rational persons, doctors for example, can't deal with it. Yeah, I think I've talked about this before, but it kind of like alludes to the idea of what is creativity. Is creativity madness, and why is it that some madness is bad and some madness is good? Like, oh my God, he's a mad genius, right? Like we do have a concept for madness being this idea of being able to create something from nothing. You kind of need to be a little bit mad because you need to see reality in a different way, which actually also, again, relates, funnily enough, to this very first image that we showed on stream today, which is this idea of like, just because you don't see reality as it is, doesn't mean that you can't create something that is new and valuable. And that kind of like deals with like the madness of like the most creative people you'll find are the ones who are in the madhouse type situation. And I find that to be an interesting concept. Dipping a watch in honey may slow it down so it keeps better time, but a more elegant time is to adjust the escapement. This one is also, I think, referring to this last one where it was talking about how we over medicated mental illness in terms of like saying like, oh, you think different than the people who are your age, and that's bad. So we're going to basically change the way that your mind's chemistry works. And this is obviously a loaded topic, and I don't have all the answers to it, but this is a really interesting kind of way of conceptualizing the idea of like, what are we actually trying to solve for? Are we trying to make someone normal so that they're suffering less? Or are we trying to make someone normal because we don't think that they're working right, quote unquote? They're broken, right? A century of advances in electronics has failed to produce any improvement in the quality of the content of the messages broadcast over the airwaves. Just so funny. Like, right? Like this idea is just how much just random trash is just on the internet, but would have also existed in the newspaper era, and even before that, the printing press era, and just random town criers. It just spreads so much faster these days. So we have now basically high speed bullshit just traveling through internet at like light speed. And it's like so funny that we have these intense technologies to get internet across the entire planet nearly instantaneously through giant undersea cables. But like, the thing that you see from giant undersea cable is like an Elon Musk tweet about like shitcoin. So it's just like, it's ridiculous. And finally, we're at the last one. Thank Jesus. For uncounted centuries, Egyptian kings and dignitaries were buried beneath simple rectangular brick structures called mastabas, or tables, which slowly and gradually became larger and more elaborate. Then, at a certain moment in Egyptian history, the mastabas tombs suddenly underwent a massive development into the monstrous pyramids of the pharaohs. What triggered this sudden plunge into grandiosity? Professor Mendelssohn has suggested that the tomb building system had reached a certain level of involvement of the entire social order, such that it became impossible to stop the process without disrupting the state. This is like also, I find to be just this is like the tragedy of the commons in a nutshell, right? Where it's like everybody is like kind of like participating in something, and they're like making the whole whole system may be worse in the long term, but because everybody is participating into it, and they're like, oh, it's not just me, like I'm not the problem, like even though they are a little bit of the problem, like we are with like global warming, for example, then the whole system eventually kind of like topples over because of everybody kind of like taking a little bit from the system. The whole system itself gets actually taken from a massive amount when you zoom out and like look at the whole system functioning. And this is kind of interesting because, like, you know, we see the seven great wonders of the world, and the pyramids are one of the seven great wonders. You know, we just were earlier talking about Ozymandias and, you know, his statues falling over, and look upon my works in despair, you know. And it's like kind of funny to imagine that like a lot of these works that we think of as just kind of like these beautiful architecture marvels, and just like these things that are just completely unique to human history, were actually literally just state projects because they were like, we need to keep people employed. So I wonder like how many of those exist today. And I can think of a couple. You know, I can think of like kind of like New York's scaffolding is actually one of a great example of this, where there was a law put into place because a few people had died of like bricks falling off of buildings in New York and like braining people, that now the whole city has this giant, like basically asinine scaffolding law. But it keeps scaffolding, like scaffolding has to be constructed every like in months, which means that there's like now a whole subset of workers whose job it is to basically just put up scaffolding and take down scaffolding and put up scaffolding and take down scaffolding in like the same place. And that's like an example that's like kind of unique. But also I think the highway system, right, like with Dwight Eisenhower's 1950s kind of idea of kind of like spreading the highway system through all of America, created basically this system where it's like, we got to add more lanes, bro. We got to add more lanes. If we don't have more lanes, then people can't get to work, but they can't get to work because we added more lanes. So people are paying more to live in more cars, and then we built suburbs, and then so that's just a giant system too, where things are just kind of dealing with this collapse. So yeah, that was Systemantics, where I'm currently at with that book. So that